This is our second talk in a 3-talk series about art world careers in collaboration with Art Market Mentors, which is a 3-month mentorship program initiated by Catherine Manson and Caroline Cyan, pairing art market professionals with established members of the industry. And the goals of these conversations are, to mystify the art industry a little bit and ask smart people, like the people that we've gathered here, how we can make that industry better and more accessible. It seems kind of always weird to be talking about art world careers when there's so much going on in the world, but I think this conversation can explore, how we can build workplaces that allow us to bring our whole selves to work. As people who exist in a world where a lot is going on. So the past few years have seen, unprecedented disruption in the workplace, and employers have been trying to build teams that reflect their audiences and the world in 2022. At the same time, they're facing budget squeezes, a global pandemic, and of course, all of the forces of racism and sexism that are built into the structures where we work. So we've brought together this all-star team to explore, what makes a rewarding and equitable workplace in the arts and what doesn't, and what choices you can make to help build one. So I'm going to start by introducing our panelists briefly. Alexandra Gill has worked in the fine art auction business for 35 years. She joined Christie's in 2009 as a director and senior specialist in prints and multiples. I had to include that she was invited to join the BBC Antiques Roadshow as a picture valuer in 2018, because that's an extremely fun fact. And in 2019, she extended her role within Christie's to run the disability pillar for the newly formed Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion team in Europe. Jonathan McBride is a partner in Heidrick and Snuggles, that's not right, Heidrick and Struggles' Los Angeles office, and a leader in its diversity, equity, and inclusion practice. Prior to joining Heidrick and Struggles, he co-founded Gradient Consulting, a small advisory firm created in the wake of George Floyd's murder to help organizations evolve their cultures and build better teams. He was appointed in 2013 to serve as director of the Presidential Personnel Office for the Obama White House. Liz Munsell is the Lorraine and Alan Bressler Curator of Contemporary Art at the MFA Boston, where she has organized numerous exhibitions of work by artists, including Basquiat, Bushra Khalili, and Cecilia Vicuña. Beginning in 2012, she worked to establish the MFA as the first encyclopedic museum in the US to fully integrate performance art into its exhibitions and permanent collection. And she also co-leads Museums Moving Forward, a group working to create a culture of accountability and equity within the museum sector. And last but not least, we have Amani Olu, the founder of Olu Company, a marketing and business consultancy at the intersection of art and social justice. He's also the co-founder of Detroit Art Week, a 5-day festival celebrating contemporary art in Detroit. Before founding Olu Company, he worked as an independent curator and arts writer, organizing more than 40 exhibitions. So to start, you all have either advised art institutions about creating cultures of equity, you've tried to change them from within, or you've built your own from the ground up. So I'm gonna ask all of you, we'll start with Liz, what are some simple indications to you that a workplace is thinking about equity in a productive way, and what may be signs that they are not?
Thanks, Julia. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, including me in this amazing camp of change makers on the screen. Because I definitely do really see everyone who's here today as part of a robust, professional and social movement within the art world that is not just critiquing and demanding change, but really generating it. So it's an honor to be here. So when I first came into the museum curatorial field 12 years ago, I believe that my contribution could be through like a programmatic shift. At the time, this was only 10, 15 years ago, museums generally were not consistently showing BIPOC artists, and the MFA, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, where I work specifically, perhaps wasn't even considering the importance of doing so. So as a bilingual English-Spanish speaking curator, coming off of 4 years of living in Latin America and the Caribbean, I really made it my mission to infuse the program as much as I could with work by BIPOC and women artists exclusively. But as time went on, and actually to this day, a woman artist has not been the subject of a solo show in the MFA Boston's biggest like blockbuster exhibition space. So I guess I began to realize that more structural change is needed. And I bring this up because you can review a museum's website and see, a list of BIPOC artists, but where are the dollars really going? Where are the resources being allocated? And I think we need to ask those questions and be transparent about them in order to achieve true equity. So, I think we need to make not just programmatic changes as curators, and certainly we need to be more than just performative with our programs. So things that I'm thinking about are broad staff engagement and empowering staff to make changes to their workplace, asking for input and being responsive when you receive that input. Regular 360 evaluations of leadership at museums, committing to fair, equitable, and flexible parental and family leave policies, committing to racial and gender equity practices in hiring. I'm sure we'll get into that more with the professionals we have on the line today. I would include salary transparency in those hiring practices for sure. Creating a general culture of having open conversations about issues that are at one time were considered closed doors. Maybe that's through something like the ending of the non-disclosure agreements. So we can all really bring out into the open the issues that we're having at our workplaces in order to create the change that we need to see rather than, stuffing it behind something like an NDA. And certainly administrations can support rather than contest staff unionization efforts that we're seeing in so many different museum settings across the country. So I'll leave it. There's a lot more, but I'll leave it at that.
Jonathan, let's go over to you since Liz mentioned hiring, and when you are working with a company or workplace, what are indications to you that they're serious about equity, and what are some signs that it might be more window dressing at the time?
I think Liz hit on the most important thing, which is going from like a programmatic or intervention mindset to a systemic mindset. There's another industry within sports. The NFL right now is in a big debate about something called the Rooney Rule, which was requiring that two people who are from underrepresented groups be interviewed for every single senior job on a team. It started many years ago. But that's like saying to, we're trying to change a sales organization, saying to people, we'll just offer two more options to the customer. We're not going to train you on how to sell those options, or we're not going to incentivize you to do better. We're not going to measure your success. We're not going to check in with you quarterly. In other words, like most things in life, you need to have a systemic approach if you want humans to adopt new behaviors. And so people who are serious are thinking systemically, but it also is going to take time. You're not going to see that immediately, and you're not going to see the returns immediately, but they're thinking more systemically. People who are less serious are thinking just on a kind of one-off activity basis. So think training versus full systems change with incentives and everything else. Those are the two big differences. And I was reading an article recently on burnout and managing stress by a Harvard professor. But one of the things he talked about in terms of like when we're in these situations when so much is going on, we can only control so much, is first reset your expectations. The other thing was, rather than looking for the exception in the workplace, the one person who might be off today, assume everybody's off. If you assume everybody's off, or everybody's struggling with the pandemic, or everybody's having some variability in their mental health, your next three decisions as a business leader will be different. So we have to kind of assume, since all humans have some bias, that bias is part of our system. And so assume everybody's a little bit off in terms of their approach to this, and then approach it that way, as opposed to looking for the one person, the manager I might intervene with.
And Alex, I would love to hear from you, having worked with a big organization like Christie's to change the way it's thinking about this? What were signs to you that Christie's was willing to engage, and and how do you then go about that?
Okay, well, I joined the ED&I team in 2019 as one of the founder members, and we all had to complete a questionnaire in order to be chosen. And one of the questions was, why do you think you'd be great joining this? So it's a big space to fill in, and I just put, you arrive at King Street in a wheelchair. Well, for those of you who don't know, there are 5 steps up into Christie's. So there's no access. And to me, that was the primary sort. If you can't get people in the building, then you're not thinking seriously about it. We had an alternative access. It needed opening up. And so we moved things around and created, street signage in order for the easy access. And it is actually independent access, which I think is incredibly important as well. So I would say access in a building is fantastic, is really important for your staff as well as for visitors. So looking at step-free access from street level, if you've got it or if you haven't, hearing loops, braille, lift, sign language, they're all really important aspects that cause huge barriers to some people. And I think the second thing is that once you have that in place, and sometimes even if it's difficult to put into place, have something on your website, an accessibility tab, so that people who are visiting you know what to expect. If you're coming to a company in a wheelchair, it's great to know that there are 3 steps up, but you can get help, or whatever it might be. That's really important. I think also, and this isn't my specialty, but IT, there are an awful lot of adaptions and things you can do when you build a website to make it much more inclusive for people. And I think finally, as a kind of opener, your job descriptions, make sure that the interview process considers access, that the job descriptions are written in a really inclusive way, because that sends a message to candidates, staff, and to the wider art market.
I'm curious, is there, just to give one example, can you think of a particular thing that could go into a job description that would sort of signal that?
Yeah, I think I was going to come to it later actually, but I think jobs that are, we've known since the pandemic that we've all been working remotely. Well, disability charities have been advocating this for decades. People with mobility issues would love to work from home. And so I think if you have a job description that can be fully 100% remote, then you should advertise it as such, because you're going to be opening up to a whole new load of candidates who perhaps wouldn't be able to travel to the office.
And Amani, I'd love to hear from you, having kind of built your own workplace, and one that has social justice sort of in its DNA. How did you bake that in and think about that from the beginning?
It was just natural, just being a Black man and having the lived experience that I have, and the work experience, and just living in New York and all the different jobs. It was just very intentional in terms of how I wanted to build the company. And I want to speak a little bit more about that later. I think for us as a marketing and PR firm that is working with clients that to some extent has some sort of social impact component. So when they come to us, we already kind of understand that they're saying we are equitable. So we generally don't have to have those conversations. So I'm looking for other things. I'm looking for certain kinds of details. I'm looking for who's in leadership and who's empowered to speak on some of these phone calls. So generally there's 3 or 4 team members. We're all on a call together. And there's someone that, has a title of, executive director or CEO. And then you'll see different people on the call, but who is actually empowered. So we're always looking at that. How does leadership talk to other staff members? How do they talk to our team? How do they send emails? When do they send emails? We have a process, an onboarding process that is very clear that, don't send us text messages. We work from 9:30 to 5:30. There are all these guardrails in place to protect the staff. Who's working outside of those lines? Who is showing up fully for the process? Because if you're coming to our firm and you're saying, you know, this is the work that we're doing in the social justice, social impact space, we're not having that conversation because you're already saying that that is your mission. But then you look at the staff and you're like, okay, well, you know, the staff itself is not actually that diverse. And when it is really diverse, those diverse voices aren't front and center. So those are some of the things that we look for in terms of understanding the culture that our clients have, because we have, you know, dozens of clients, you know, representing all sorts of industries. And sometimes those projects are 3 months and sometimes they're 3 years. So we're not going to know what that culture is really like until we really get under the hood and start working. So we have certain guardrails on how we work internally. And then if that client isn't necessarily as equitable in what they do, we can kind of shift them without them knowing that, you know, you can't send, you know, junior associates emails at 7:30 and expect an immediate response. That's not equitable.
And I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about hiring. You know, we often hear the same explanation for why so many art workplaces, whether that's auction houses or galleries or art media or museums, are primarily white, and you know, executive levels are primarily white and male, and cisgendered and non-disabled. And that explanation is that it's a pipeline problem, or it's hard to find people. And you know, other people say employers are just not looking hard enough, or they're not looking in the right places. And so I'm wondering what you all would say to those employers, and what steps you would recommend they take to kind of go beyond performative hand wringing. So we'll start with Jonathan.
Well, it's first off, the challenge is all of the above, right? In most of these instances, there are both, you know, historic pipeline challenges, as well as there are a lot of challenges to the approach people take. And I would say that first, if you kind of look at the conversation on this topic, it's moved a lot more quickly recently into a conversation about how people treat each other once they're at your place of work, not solely looking at your hiring. Because for a long time, we were talking about I&D or DEI. We're really just talking about D. Like, are we hiring people? What does that group look like? Especially at the bottom of our organization. Not are we retaining them? Are we advancing them at similar rates? Are we providing equal opportunity to two people who look different arrive at the first day at our office and have equal chances to run the company one day? None of that. We were just like, let's just get them to the front door. But there's been a big shift. And I think it's appropriate because these two things interrelate, right? Having critical mass or having a better sense of belonging, more welcoming place is going to give you a better chance to recruit and retain people of different backgrounds. So they kind of interrelate. And I would say those two things have been quite a big shift. But the other thing that people have been probably more honest with themselves about is it's going to take a while to diversify your workplace. So one of the places I worked was a big financial services company. And while we were hiring far more women than men every single year, we calculated it was going to take us 14 years to get to parity, just because you only hire so many people a year, right? So that was math. That wasn't like anything so unexpected. So we had to be appropriately ambitious as to how fast we diversified the organization. But we decided we would be extremely impatient with managers who tell us they don't need to be more inclusive of people different from themselves. Because then everybody we put in your care, we're giving a disadvantage to if they're not like you. And so you have to break those two things apart. How am I hiring? And how are people treating each other? And what are the incentives I have to make that a better experience for people? And I would argue you can be really impatient about one because it's a choice by each individual to get better or not. And then the other will just take time, but you have to be realistic with yourself about that. And then in intervening time, obviously, more and more people are asked to produce progress and results on these things, and people need to understand it's not going to be linear. It doesn't. Your numbers don't always go up; they go up and down and up and down and up and down. You hope you're making progress over time. So that's been our experience working with companies over time, is that you have to be realistic about the time it's going to take, but then you also have to be realistic and concrete about your expectations of people in your organization.
And I'm curious too. I mean, the thing about the art world in particular is I think it's relatively small. And so often the impulse is to just go with your network, right? But that just perpetuates everything that we've been talking about. And also there is kind of such, everyone is so time poor and resource stretched that, you know, there's this feeling of like, okay, well, we're going to do this like really creative thing for the next time we hire. You know, and it's not, there aren't kind of KPIs or raises or anything kind of attached to changing the composition of teams. And I wonder, you know, Amani, from hiring kind of a team from the ground up, you know, how did you approach hiring and think about that?
Initially, it was really about skill and making sure that the associate had the proper experience, or that there was enthusiasm and a willingness to learn, because in the early days, I was heavily involved in the training. So if you were a great writer, I would assume that I could turn you into an amazing publicist, right? That was like the thinking. It was just a different time. We just needed good writers who were focused, could show up and wanted to be pitching, because not a lot of people want to pitch journalists and chase journalists down and do the dance that you have to do. Once we figured out we could hire associates and train them into becoming publicists, then there became a larger appetite for having BIPOC team members, because it was important to us, and our clients also wanted to see that representation. And it's challenging. You know, it's not easy. We are often looking for BIPOC individuals to join the team, but it's not, you know, there are a lot of challenges that we face in trying to hire for those positions.
Liz, I know Museums Moving Forward has thought about staffing as well, and I'm curious what your take on this is.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really encouraged by the recent turn in museums towards ending the unpaid internships. You know, there was a call, I believe in 2019, by a group called Art and Museum Transparency to do so. And a lot of institutions, I think, have really followed suit to address some of this pipeline problem. At the same time, like, I don't want to be snarky in my answer, but there is a Facebook group that's existed since 2015 with 5,000 members called Binder Full of People of Color in the Art World. Like, these people are out there, and BIPOC talent in the art world, you know, abounds. And so if there are issues, you know, I think it does come back to the art world's tendency towards, you know, old boys club sort of mentalities. And, you know, I think it's just a real challenge to shift folks' mindsets outside of their individual networks. But I think increasingly, like, I haven't heard leadership say in a long time, like, it's just so hard to find folks of color. I just haven't even heard that stated. Like, it's not even okay really to say it quite like that, because institutions know at this point that, you know, their survival depends on the degree of, you know, diversity of perspectives in their workplaces, if they want to be, you know, engaging with the diverse publics that we have as our constituents. So.
And, you know, another element which Jonathan mentioned earlier is, you know, hiring a diverse workforce is one thing, but then creating an environment where everyone can succeed and advance is another. I mean, I think an easy one to look at is NPR is a great example, where, you know, they made a real push to hire particularly, you know, Black reporters, and now a lot of them are kind of leaving in all in one go. And so, you know, how do you make sure that once people are in the door, they're listened to and empowered to do their jobs? Let's start with Alexandra for that question.
I think the first thing to do is to, obviously this depends on the size of your company, but having a reasonable adjustments policy is really important, because when people are coming in, the on-board section at the time when people arrive, you can ask them if they need any adaptations. Perhaps they might like an orthopedic chair or a stand-up desk, anything that might make life a bit easier. That also creates a kind of environment for staff to know that they can ask if their situation changes. So that's a really important policy. I think, as I mentioned before, remote working is an absolute game changer for so many people, not having to commute and to come into an office. Training managers, that's really important. I know an awful lot of pressure comes on the managers for being good at absolutely everything, but being able to spot the signs if you have a member of staff that is struggling, that's important. And also to be comfortable with asking the questions and not being frightened of the language surrounding disability, because it's much better to be a little clunky in your language than to just ignore the situation. I mean, there are an awful lot of companies out there that can give advice. We here in the UK, we partnered a company called the Business Disability Forum, and they've got fantastic resources on how to deal with these challenges. So that's something to look out for.
Julia, I also wanted to add that I think when it comes to hiring, sometimes it's the institution. It may have a reputation for being toxic. So people don't want to work there that are qualified or that fit into, whatever that company's diversity, metrics are. You see a job posting and you're like, oh, I know that place. Like, no way am I going to apply for that job. So I think that that's a huge part of it as well, is that, yes, you might see these job postings or you might hear that these companies are hiring, but it's like, well, do I want to work there? Do I want to give, my cultural and intellectual, property to a company that represents X, Y, and Z is super huge. And I think that it's challenging hiring just in general. Anyone who runs a business knows that it's just a challenge, but we have to keep at it, keep trying, work harder. It's not something that we can say, well, we spent the year, trying to hire in this capacity and, we're done. We're just going to go back to doing things the way we used to do them. If it's a priority for your organization, that is part of the fight.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to that, because there's kind of a couple countervailing factors. So first, from a macro sense, I think the Me Too movement leading into kind of the George Floyd response moved a lot of the pressure from outside into organizations from inside out, meaning most leaders of organizations started feeling a lot more pressure from the employees they actually have, less from the markets they're in or their customers or whatever the case may be. That is a positive sign, because employees aren't going anywhere. Like if it's outside, you can wait for the news cycle to change or the attention to go down and you go back to your old way. Your employees are going to be there and keep demanding it. It's also the case that we've seen one of the largest labor movements in our adult lives, with people kind of being willing to leave if people don't live up to their values or kind of respond to them or see them accurately, which also has been good because it's shifted more power to the employee versus the employer. But when people are tired, when it's hard to hire people, when you just got to get someone through the door, it's easier for people to avoid everything we've been talking about and just say, we just got to get the person, or this is the best person I know because their resume looks like mine, or whatever the case may be. So this is both a time for more power in the, on a person by person employee basis, but it's also a time where people can abuse this stuff quite a bit because people aren't paying as much attention and they really need to hire people because they have these vacancies and work isn't getting done. So it's a time to be more vigilant, actually, not less.
That's actually a great transition to the next question. And I want to start with Liz on that, which is, what can employees do to advocate for a healthy workplace? What do they have the right to ask for, and how can they leverage capital that they may have internally to advocate for change?
Yeah, I think we're lucky in that, culture is not something that is created from the top down all the time. And Amani, I couldn't agree with you more about the problems around toxic workplaces, but fortunately the word gets out, right? And the pressure can be can be on. I think that some of the employee resource groups and affinity groups that have been forming, and especially the larger museum settings, may have seemed at first like sort of performative, or like support groups, but have actually, had some policy impacts as time has gone on. And I think that's really important in terms of like working towards a cultural shift within organizations that is creating a space where people can bring their whole selves to work and contribute, no matter what their background is. And it's a shift in the mentality of management, I would say. Like if museum management was traditionally a C-suite of men or a single male leader, like getting almost sole credit for the work that a mostly pink-collared workforce is doing, then leadership today looks like transparency around who is doing the work. Everybody's name on the exhibition wall text, not just the curators. Salary transparency and equity and opportunities for growth. As I said before, 360 reviews of managers, and just a culture of vulnerability in leadership. Like everybody should be able to say, I messed up, I'm sorry, let's talk about what happened. Here's what I'm going to do to fix it. What do you think? Is that enough? Like just openness, and to, fear about the changes that are being demanded in the workplace by staff, rather than just resisting them and trying to shove them behind closed doors. And certainly, efforts around unionizing when necessary, something else that employees can do to contribute to changes in their workplace.
And Alexandra, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Liz. I think there's a really, I think it's quite an exciting time. There are an awful lot of companies now, as we're doing, where we have these kind of tea talks, and we kind of open the forum to staff where they can discuss experiences. And we had one planned actually for the disability one, talking about, hidden disabilities, and non-hidden disabilities that we had to cancel it because of COVID just before Christmas. But those are the kinds of discussions that we have, and people can come together from all parts of the business to talk about that just quite comfortably. I think also I would say that I think if you do, for instance, need a stand-up desk or some help at work at all, it's really important to go to your manager, because actually by doing that, you do create, you do influence new policy in a company, and they're thinking, oh, okay, that she might not be the only person that wants that. Maybe there's somebody else that wants that. And then suddenly that becomes part of your whole HR policy and procedure. And I think that it's great because it helps people that come after you. So everything you can do to get the word out helps the next cohort.
And I mean, yeah, that's a good opportunity to shift a little bit and think about the employer point of view. And I'm curious about sort of what resources can employers implement or provide for employees to feel safe to discuss their experience. And I'll start with Jonathan on that.
Well, I can tell you something that's getting better, which is employers are starting to find ways to learn more about how people are actually feeling on a week by week, month by month, not just an annual basis. Part of that has been forced by the pandemic and people being so distributed. So think about it. Most employers these days have a third to half of their people were hired since January 1, 2020. So a third to half of their people had not experienced their culture in a face-to-face way in most of the world, and had a very different experience. So that's forced people to develop new ways of listening to people and learning about them and identifying where there might be challenges. So if you're an employer, and if you don't have a plan for the 1/3 to half people I just talked about, if you don't actually have a strategy on engaging them and finding out how they're feeling, you've got a problem. So that should be number one. You should really focus on that, because they are experiencing something very different than other folks based on what we've been finding. Two, if you don't have a regular dialogue with your people and allow them to give you candid feedback and information back, and if you're not doing something regularly with that, you're also behind the times. Like that is not going to work in a general workplace. But three, and you've seen this a bit in the chat, if you incentivize people to be successful at producing something, controlling the quality of something, or selling something, but you don't incentivize them to hire the people to do all those things in a way that you want them to, when push comes to shove at the end of the month, when quota, people are hitting targets, what are they going to spend time on? The thing that's measured and the thing they're compensated to do. So we've got to be as serious about the goals we have about putting people in place, which means you need to have targets. You need to break them down into smaller groups. People need to be rewarded and incentivized by them. You need to be transparent with people about how you're reaching those targets. I would argue, back to your original question though, I think people now know that a small, well-organized group of people can advocate and get their attention heard. I think there's going to be more and more pressure, especially generationally, on leaders of organizations, and I think that's going in one direction. So again, I think if managers and leaders aren't tapping into this and changing the way they're thinking about things on a systemic basis, they're either going to be in the first group and be ahead of this curve, or they're going to get dragged as their workforce changes generationally. And that's what I hear CEOs talking most about. They're talking a lot about Gen Z and how values-based and principles-based they are, and how they make decisions about whether they're willing to work for you or not, because it's very different than other generations in the workforce. And it's confounding a lot of people. So there's a lot that people can do. It's really a question of whether they're willing to do it.
And Amani, I would love to hear your answer to this question too, because I think, so many art businesses are smaller and less corporate already, but sometimes that can create this we're all a family vibe, which makes it sometimes harder to hold people accountable, especially people above you. So yeah, from your perspective in an arts organization, what do you think?
Well, at first, I wanted to make sure I was being intentional in terms of how we developed a safe workplace environment. So initially, we just had these set of core values, and I'll read them for you. The first one is exceeding client expectations. It's not so much making the client happy, because I don't know if I can do that, but I can, work to exceed your expectations. Employee happiness is really kind of above everything. And the way we demonstrate that is we have very generous time off. So we have mental health days, we have personal days, sick days, because I remember there would be times where I just needed to go to the bank, right? And I just needed a half a day to deal with that, but I wasn't sick. It wasn't, I wasn't having a mental health issue. I didn't need to just be at home and just process. So we really thought about what are all the different moments that our associates will experience, and how can we provide days off for that. So when you're actually sick, you can be sick and not, running a Target or picking up your mom from the airport. We cover healthcare for all of our associates. We have around 15 staff members, so 100% healthcare. So again, and other fringe benefits, but the idea was when you come to work, you should be comfortable and set up for success, not stressed out because you really need a day off, but you're not going to get it because the environment is not set up for that. Transparency is really key. We, particularly with our clients, we like to be transparent about everything. Creativity, of course, is super important because, we are arts, PR firm. And there's something here called sort of thinking about all the different lived experiences that make up Olu Company and sort of holding space for those. So when we consult with clients, we're not coming from, a homogenous point of view. We're tapping into all of our networks to be able to properly advise. So you may have a junior associate who they're on their third week, but they have a certain experience or expertise. We want to be bringing them into conversations to make sure that we are advising, and that's really empowering. Another thing that we do, we have a director of operations, and she meets with team members weekly and just understands everything that they're going through and that they're feeling. In her previous role, she was an organizational fixer for, major healthcare providers. So when she came to our company, she just set up all of these systems that made it so that I could, as you talked about earlier, Jonathan, I was getting information so I could make better decisions about how to create an environment that was safe for people. So for example, everyone's working from home. We should be covering 50% of the internet, 50% of their phone bills, like that sort of thing, that no one's going to come to me as the CEO. They're just not going to talk to me about those kinds of things. But there's a space where they can talk to someone on a team. And then I come back, then the colleague will come to me, and it's not like this person needs this or this person needs that. It's like, I've been talking to the team for the past 2 weeks, and this is what I'm hearing. I'm advising that you do this. And then, if it makes sense, we go ahead and do it. So we're always creating different systems and methods to make sure the team feels safe so that they could do the thing that they're being hired to do, which is exceed client expectations. And if you're stressed out, under duress, overworked, tired, burnt out, you're not going to be able to do that.
Yeah. Wow. So you pay half their internet?
We pay half internet, half phone bill, full medical, and there's other stuff in there too that I'm sure that I just don't even know about.
Everyone in the chat wants to work for you now, just so you know.
I do too.
Yeah, right?
Julia, can I say one thing about that though?
Please.
One of the things that Amani's talking about, those are the little things. And little things matter a lot, in part because when you don't do them, people are like, why aren't you doing them? They're easy and so on and so forth. And people will usually tell you the little things, but you have to create the safe environment, which clearly he intentionally has done, to get that information from people and have them tell you. And we have been conditioned a long time ago not to bring our personality to work. We've been told we're too this or we're too that, or could you be more this or less that. It's been sanded down for all this period of time. And so I think you have to reframe the fact that people walk in every day and bring all of this in with them. This is not a workplace issue. This is a cultural, contextual issue. And you have to default to everything I read in the paper is probably going through people's minds when they come to work. And so if I assume that, then I'm going to design differently. I'm going to talk differently. I'm going to engage differently. But that is a very big mind shift. And in industries where you have a lot more people who want to work in the industry than you have seats, in industries that think of themselves as super progressive because maybe of the work they do, it's harder because people kind of have a moral license. They kind of give themselves a pass because of what they do or because of the volume of candidates they can choose from. And so both of those things make it harder.
Yeah. And I think, it's tempting to think of the art world as progressive, but in so many ways, as people are also pointing out in the chat, it's very old fashioned. It's an old boys club still in a lot of ways. And I'm curious about how, thinking about the art world in context of other sectors, specifically creative sectors, but not limited to that, how is the art world ahead of other sectors, and in what ways is it behind? And someone also pointed out, that among all the other things that we're talking about, age discrimination is also, a factor in the art world as well. So I'll start with Liz on that.
Yeah, I think compared to other industries, one area that the art world is incredibly behind on is just basic data about like what our cultural workers are experiencing. I'm part of a group called Museums Moving Forward that is seeking to create a culture of equity and accountability in museum environments. And there's just no data out there in terms of, all of the staff turnover that we're seeing, the experience of BIPOC employees, gender inequity in the workplace. And I think, gathering the data is really important. Then, of course, if you don't have a culture of responding to the data because you're time poor, then there's also a problem. So I think it's both creating a culture that is responsive, as we've been speaking to, and having the data to point to prove to your board, your constituents, like why it's so important that these changes happen. But yeah, I think it's very hard. Museums are incredibly traditional institutions. And as Jonathan spoke to before, like in terms of diversity and hiring, it was really about the D, only the D at first. And, you know, people are expected to perform their identities. Like as a woman, I have to take care of other people in my workplace emotionally. And I don't, you know, that detracts from my actual work and the goals of the organization. But yet there are these gendered expectations. And so a lot of that kind of like phantom work, I think, is just not, people don't receive credit for it. And it's kind of, it's in the shadows rather than being acknowledged, because there's a lack of a progressive mindset in the art world and museum institutions. But at the same time, I'm super hopeful, honestly, because so many of these structural inequities have been laid bare by some incredible activism that we continue to see, you know, over the last couple of years, over the last 5 years. And of course, you know, we're a part of that. And institutions generally know that in order to survive, maintain relevance into the future, they have to adapt and change.
I want to switch gears to make sure that we can answer questions soon. But Jonathan, I'm curious, you know, as someone who works across, who has worked, you know, in some art organizations and also many others, what your view is on sort of where the art world falls short and where it may be ahead of the game.
It's probably fair to say the art world as an industry or as a group of employers is behind kind of the general marketplace, but I also think the gap between the best and the worst is not as wide as people think. I don't think anybody's all particularly that great. I mean, there are, like, if you really try, if you can find an organization that can say dispositively that people after 3 years of being here are more inclusive and welcoming to people different from themselves for having worked here, I would give you $1 million. Like, there's just not that many people who've actually really made progress on these things. There are people who are trying, which is a really good indication, because you have to try and fail when you're in a startup mode. And let's be clear, we're in a startup mode. But I think it's really convenient to like look at your peers and say we're 1% better than our peers, but you know, that's like being a slightly better house in a bad neighborhood. It's not really the right comparison. I think for the organizations that are serious, they're making absolute decisions. Like Amani made a decision about how he's going to run his organization when he started. He's been sticking to it. It's not about what other people look like who have organizations like his. It's like what's right for him. And I think that's important for organizations to do, to figure out what's right for themselves and what people can align on, and then start working at it. But I think that it's very convenient to look laterally and compare, and we all do it, right? Companies do it all the time. But I would say that reflects a poverty of ambition.
And I want to start bringing in some of the audience questions. This one is for Liz, and it's asking if you can speak more about working in the nonprofit sector where people are so often told that resources are not available. I would also add this isn't just in the nonprofit sector, so we may want to open it up too. But you know, the resources are not available, and low-level staff are put in the position to advocate and push for organizational transparency, and often kind of putting their own careers on the chopping block. So how do you navigate the kind of like, if the pushback you get is like, oh, there aren't enough resources, what do you say next, or where do you go?
Yeah, I mean, that's why salary transparency is so important. And you can certainly, you know, look up the top salaries, the top makers at your institution online, just be aware of that. And I think it's hard to say, and I'm curious others on the screen's response as well. You know, it's hard to say no to a standing desk when, you know, a director is making $1 million plus salary. I mean, distribution of resources in a way that ensures, you know, staff can do their jobs and not experience the level of burnout that we're seeing in the art world and just people dropping out of the workforce. I think it's really important to talk numbers in that regard. And that's, of course, why there isn't transparency around salaries and budgets. But demanding it, I think, is extremely important in our workplaces.
Does anyone else have thoughts on that? Because I do think, I'm sure it comes up a lot in nonprofit workplaces, but it does in for-profit workplaces too, that, budgets are stretched, yada, yada, we'll prioritize this next quarter, et cetera, et cetera.
I think you have to change, two things. I think we kind of have the cost benefit kind of out of whack, right? So if I just let you keep doing what you're doing and you keep hiring people more alike, that's actually more risky because groupthink goes up, which means our accuracy goes down and, workplace accidents go up and quality of work goes down. And so I think we need to kind of shift the cost thought in our brain, which is, if we make a bad decision now and own it for 5 years of somebody working here, is that worse than us taking an extra couple months and making a better hire, right? That's a different cost question. The other thing I would say is, and this I feel passionate about, so this is a personal bias of mine, but when we're talking about people being willing to change behaviors, we have to make it a cost not to change too. Like, that's a decision too. So if I give you a better way of working with people different from you and you decide to not adopt it, I have to make that your decision too. You have to own the decision not to do something, not just to do something different that's better. Both have to be a decision, and then I can have a more balanced conversation, because we make it all about getting you to do something new. And the burden is on us to convince you to do something new, as opposed to you to convince me why you shouldn't have to do something new if we're paying you to manage other people. So I think, again, switching the incentives is really important, and thinking differently about cost.
How do you do that?
Well, first of all, you literally say it. Like, this sounds really basic, but being very clear, that's why values and principles can really matter. They're sometimes written on walls and they're not real. But everybody's worked in an organization where people do live out those values, where you kind of can feel them and understand them. So being very clear that both things are a choice. And then you have, honestly, and people have been talking about this over and over in the chat, if you're not measuring something, even if it's not a precise measurement, even if it's behaviors or it's directional, if you're not measuring it in any way, how in the world are you going to know? Right? So, and I would say you're not going to be perfect. Just try to measure it. And if it doesn't work, know better. And so let me give you a perfect example. If I want someone to be a more inclusive leader, I might first measure, did they go to a session that we did? Did they go online and look at any of the follow-up materials we sent them? Do the people around them start to notice their behavior changing? And then do people start feeling better about working for them? That might take 2 years, but you want to start thinking and watching and monitoring the behaviors that lead to the outcomes you want. And if you're not finding ways to do that, which now there are lots of people, resources to get lots of information from maybe almost too much information from the people working from you. You just have the guts to ask the question and get the information. So there's a lot of ways to do that. To some earlier points that people made, I think people are nervous about having that information, because then you got to do something.
And yeah, I mean, this is sort of a follow-on from that question, but I think, the general sort of feelings being expressed in the chats too are that, maybe even once you have transparency, or maybe once you have those trainings, like, you still don't see meaningful change. And so what do you do if you get to a point, either as an employee or as a manager, where the workplace just isn't valuing this, as they should? And it's, you as an employee or a manager can see the long-term problems that's going to create, but you may not have the power. You're not sitting in that one seat to change the way money is spent or change the way people are evaluated.
Go work somewhere else.
Yeah, leave. That's it. You can make a decision to stay or make a decision to leave. And I mean, that's pretty much what happened with me. I realized that I was not going to be able to, I felt like I had a lot of value that I could give to an employer when I was working in New York at different art jobs. But, we all probably have been through this. They find out who you are, they bring you in, and there's a whole list of things that they want to change. And they see you as the person who can kind of help, usher in those changes. And literally on day one, you realize, oh, wait, they got me again. They don't want to see any actual changes. They're not interested in my ideas. Sometimes I feel like they just wanted to, they just wanted a great hire. They wanted someone that they knew could do a certain kind of job, but not really bring any of their insights, lived experience to the table. And after years of that, I was just like, I'm going to have to start my own business where I can create the culture in which I want to work. But not everyone has the courage to do that. Not everyone can afford to do that. And it's very hard. There were a lot of years in the early days where it was a struggle. So if you have mortgage and children, back then I didn't have all of that. But if, you've built up a certain lifestyle working for people and you have serious, bills and responsibilities, you can't just get up and leave. So it's challenging.
Can I add one thing, Julia, which is, it's also important to recognize people when they are changing and doing things. So just as it's important to walk out if you just realize that the situation's not going to get better, it doesn't work for you because life is short. When a leader or manager is actually trying to do something different, which means it's uncomfortable for them, doing something that they haven't done before, and it's really not like their first default, but they've learned something, you really need to give them positive reinforcement. You need to shout them out. We need to celebrate the positive outliers as much as target the people who are not doing these types of things. What we found over and over again is we could find a million ways to incentivize people, but the number one thing that changed in managers' behavior was they changed something about a meeting, and someone emails them and says, "Hey, everyone noticed you made that change in the meeting. They love it. Keep doing it." That manager is not going to go back, and they're probably going to call someone and say, "Hey, what can I do next that's going to work?" So, again, simple instrumentation, but positive reinforcement and shouting out people who are trying, not wait until they're perfect, is really, really important.
Yeah, and that actually maybe leads me to a good final question, and any of you can kind of pop in with it. But just because I anticipated that this was going to get kind of a bummer, my last, even though it wasn't, you guys were still very positive and that was good, but I did think that it would. I wanted to ask, for anyone that has had a really positive experience in a workplace, what was it?
I mean, I would say not in general, but there would be moments where you worked really hard, you did a really good job, and you got recognized for it. I remember when I first started working in PR, there were probably a handful of moments where I felt valued, but then there were, for every one, there was, 100 where you're just like, man, how did this, how am I working here? This place is crazy. But those moments where I did receive positive reinforcement, where I knew I killed it and I was acknowledged, those were the building blocks for me to say, I could probably do this on my own and create an environment. And I know this isn't on topic, but it's funny, we are doing our best to create this, a safe environment for our team. But a lot of our associates, this could be their second or, first or second, job, right? And they don't know. And you're trying to explain to them no, you don't understand. This is as good as it gets. There's no other place you can work that is going to do all of these things. You're pleading with them, listen to me. The art world is toxic. You do not want to go and do this thing that you feel like you need to do. It is going to be bad, but it's just words. They weren't there and they don't have that experience. So even though we do all of these things, it's still challenging. It's not like we're sitting back and there's this utopia. Every day we have to wake up, suit up, and try to make sure we're doing the right thing so people feel good about the work that they're doing.
Anyone else have any parting motivating experiences?
Something that I try to think about when doing this work, because it's a lot of times you're looking at the ocean, you're how do I boil this thing? And that just seems to be overwhelming, or standing at the seaside. my best friend's father had this saying for people in his place of work, because they did really tough stuff and they would win some and lose some. When a young person who's new to the organization had a really bad loss, right? Like, and they felt personal about it, he would, walk home with them that day and tell them, rather than trying to save the world tomorrow, how about you walk in the office and find someone you can put your hand on their shoulder and make them have a better day. That's it. So like shrinking this stuff down to a person by person thing, especially as individuals, and saying, hey, today, can I do something for one other person? Is a really good way to start your virtual walk to the office, which is probably from your bedroom into the room. But the point is, like, sometimes thinking it down to the little things that each of us can do is a way to do it. And the most memorable things people have done for me have been those types of things. Like when they surprised me out of nowhere and I felt they had my back, or they just noticed that I was needed some help or whatever the case may be. And they probably don't even remember them because they're nothing little things. But I would say all of us have the power to do something for someone else every day or week. And if everybody in the organization decided to do that, the place would be a better place to work.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you all so much. Thank you so much for your time coming in from coast to coast, and London, LA, Boston, Detroit, and all of you for joining us. I really appreciate this conversation. It will be recorded and posted on YouTube in the coming days. And check back on Artnet for details on next month's talk, which will be at the end of March. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
So